Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back to the session. Can the people at the back please take your seats so that we can wrap up our last session in good time? It's filling up really nicely. It's always good when people come back. This particular session is our concluding part of the power shifting. And of course, the three different groups have gone away and had their deliberations and insights and reflections. And we now have a moment where we want to hear from the repertoire the summary of some of the discussions that have been taking place. And this session report is important because it's going to give us the color and the texture of the conversations, but also start stimulating some ideas around solutions, different contexts in which this work needs to happen. And so I'm going to call Kristen Kruger from FHI 360 to give us that report out, followed then later on by an amazing speaker, Anu, which I will introduce in no time. And we will then have our deliberations about the way forward. So thank you, Kristen.
Power is shifting. Hi, everyone. I just have the small job of calling up our rapporteurs. So I'm going to have all the rapporteurs just come up onto the stage so we can save a little bit of time. And we're going to start with Helen Owino from Advocacy Accelerator, who will be reporting back from the first group, the equitable funding, moving the money to the global south. So Helen.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So for our group, what does it mean to move money to the global south? We began our discussions talking about concepts, debates about decoloniality and how they inspire the panelists and the people who were in the plenary. And these are some of the responses we got, that the discourse influences the who, the how, and what is funded. And then the discourse shapes the way policies are made and how finances are shifted to support different issues. We also talked about it opening up conversations on accountability and questioning who is deciding what gets funded, who decides what success even looks like. And then we talked about it creating an opportunity for us to show intentionality in walking the talk. We keep talking about decoloniality, but are we walking the talk? Then it brings to fore the power symmetry involved in our work and shows where the actual power lies, and that it has provided the opportunity for us to showcase who holds power from the impact of actions that are being done in the field. So stories about communities and the implementers actually being the power wielders. Then we talked about characteristics of successful partnership, what it looks like from a donor perspective and also from the implementer perspective. And from the donor perspective, we had that for them it's about focusing on organization capacity building to strengthen ability to partner with the donor in terms of funding processes. Then grants supporting organizations to be re-granters, so availability of funds now, supporting organizations to be re-granters and offering opportunities to organizations in the global south to lead the change. And then the issue about rethinking and disrupting language or terms used. So instead of implementers, now we are using terms like partnership. And then inclusion in decision-making tables and ensuring transparency. So working with other organizations, being transparent on what budget is available and then co-creating programs together with them. From an implementer perspective, decentralization of decision making. So issues around making decisions, taking into account what communities have to say about programming, then rethinking recruitment approach of implementing organizations. So we spoke about the need for pre-financing and how it has influenced ability of other organizations being part of decision making. Then there's the bit where we need to consider each partner as a resource for seeking solution entity. And lastly, our recommendations and tools and approaches that are being used. So provision of core flexible funding to organizations. Then the need to simplify core flexible funding application process, increased support to social movements, and if you just go to the next slide, appreciation and recognition of expertise from different levels. So we have experts, young or even just African women, but then when we are talking about expertise, it refers to people from a certain region or field. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. That's fine. And next, we're going to hear from Tracy Baird from Engender Health, who is the rapporteur for the operational barriers to equity.
Thank you, and thank you to the group who made it over to the other hotel and upstairs and downstairs. But I'll tell you, we had the room with the spinning disco ball. So I'm just, sorry you weren't able to join us. We got the ball turned on for our session. We had little glitter around the top of the room. It was exactly what we needed for this important conversation. So we captured a couple of things in our notes here, just on 2 slides. The first is we looked at a model about what are the different components. When we talk about operational changes, challenges, barriers, what do we mean even by these operational systems? So we looked at institutional architecture, how we're designed, people and culture, funding and financial systems, so thank you to Helen and the previous group on a lot of that, and risk and compliance. So that's what we mean by our operational systems, right? How are we designed to do the work, the how of the work in global health and in international family planning, especially here. We also looked at the need to balance the interests, priorities, skills, power of funders, international NGOs, national NGOs, probably others in this ecosystem. We work together, and if we don't find some sort of homeostasis, some better balance among us, then our power isn't shifting, right? We need to be able to work together, and absent any one of these key players in the ecosystem, if you imagine a 3-legged stool, the stool will fall down, and as Joseph said in our session, we will have no place to sit. So let's keep the stool up. We had a wonderful panel, and a few things came up from their experience on the panel. First, that change is messy. These conversations can be uncomfortable. In fact, if they're not uncomfortable, you may not be going deep enough and far enough. So make space, time, the self-care required to have those uncomfortable conversations. We will make mistakes as we make this change, as we shift power, as we move towards different models, and mistakes are part of the process. We need time to make them, and we need the process to learn from them. And evolution is possible. We learned from our panelists. We heard about the Ouagadougou Partnership moving from an INGO-supported network to being regionally supported network. We learned from FP2030 going from having sort of one global host and home to having multiple regional hosts and homes. We learned from IPASS about going from having in Latin America multiple country offices to having a regional approach and a regional network and a global network really that's going to help really lift up the needs, opportunities, and expand the expertise in a region. And transparency and participation are critical, absolutely critical for this change. So on the next slide, we have a few recommendations and calls to action. So move towards these participatory approaches. Everyone should be able to make decisions in their own areas of work, whether that is in your work in human resources or in finances or in managing logistics. But transform your programs to suit the people in needs. Don't try to change the people necessarily to suit the programs. Recognize that one person can be the barrier that blocks everything. We heard an example of a program and a partnership that was well designed, common principles, core goals, everything working until one person put up all the barriers. So how do we transform that person, remove that person, and make things change? We need to re-articulate the skills required for our work. What do we need to do it? And who has those skills? As I think Helen mentioned, like, the expertise comes from different directions. Let's recognize it, let's value it, let's build on all of our skills. And ensure the resources are available to do this work, whether that's resources and funding for translation, the time required to do things in multiple languages, the time required to ensure that the right people are at the table and able to participate, and the time to try something, and if it's not quite getting you where you need to go, or you're ready to go to another stage, to do it again, to do more, right? This is an evolution. And finally, we wanted to call out that we want to redefine how we define capacity. Again, how this came up, I think, in the opening plenary this morning, too. Where is the expertise and the knowledge, and what is it that we need to do the work? We want to achieve impact. How do we make sure that we are pulling on the vast human and technical and experiential resources available, the learnings we have from the universe and not just the universities, to make sure that together we are affecting massive change? So thank you, and thank you so much to everyone who was with us in the strobe room.
Thank you, Tracy. Our last rapporteur is Lynn Nguyen from Johns Hopkins, who will be reporting back from Unpacking Power Relationships and Dynamics.
Thank you. I have the incredible honor and very difficult task of summarizing the rich conversation that we had in our session. Today we really tried to unpack the implicit assumptions behind the power dynamics and relationship dynamics that currently exist as it stands. We also realized that the power imbalances that we have now are perpetuated by the current business model that we have in development. Most of the institutional structures and hierarchies and power dynamics that we have within INGOs are dictated by a lot of the donor requirements and expectations around compliance, accountability, and we really wanted to challenge ourselves to think about the language that we use and what we mean by accountability and to whom, and how we generally view accountability as a positive thing, but really that has been a tool to perpetuate some of these power imbalances. We talked about wanting to re-examine our social accountability tools and thinking critically about who it is that we are accountable to. A lot of times we talk about accountability in the sense of being accountable to donors and bilaterals, as opposed to being accountable to the communities that we serve. We also had a really vibrant conversation about the assumptions around how our structures currently work and how that's based on a lot of distrust that's implicit in the way that we do grant making, and how we need to shift to a trust-based model for relationships. In terms of recommendations, we really wanted to challenge the group within our concurrent session and within this broader group to reimagine a different business model for development. And we want to challenge the group to be radical and disruptive and bold in our aspirations, while recognizing that we have to take incremental steps to make changes within our organizations and within our own work, but to not lose sight of the radical change that we're seeking. We want to think about also how to stop centering development work around northern standards, whether it's for grant writing, documentation, reporting, financial management requirements, and other compliance issues. And that would enable more flexibility for us to really shift power to the Global South and to the communities that we're meant to serve. We also want to challenge donors to recognize and remove what I'm calling self-manufactured barriers to power shifting. We recognize that a lot of the challenges that we have today are man-made problems. Recognizing that, we're saying that we need intermediaries to review and oversee grants because a lot of local organizations don't have the capacity, for example, to write these grants according to the way that we've designed the proposals. And so, there's really no reason that, we need to have this additional layer because we expect everything to be written in the American and British English that donors are requiring when business is not conducted in this language on the ground. So I realize my time is up, and just the last piece is emphasizing the importance for shared decision-making across all of the different levels. And one of the things that we want to leave the group with is to urge us to continue having this conversation because we realize half a day for a pre-conference is not enough. This is just scratching the surface of the issue, and we hope that we all will continue this dialogue offline. Thank you.
Thank you. Special thank you to the rapporteurs who had a hard job distilling what came out of those concurrent sessions and putting them into just a few slides and just a few bullets. So next, I believe Dr. T is coming back to the stage.
Thank you so much, colleagues. That was really great. We have definitely just scratched the surface, but we have to start where we're at, yeah? And now I would like to introduce Dr. Anu Kumar, who is the president and CEO of IPAS, which is an international NGO that works around the world to advance reproductive justice by expanding access to abortion and contraception. She's currently, she is internationally recognized as an advocate for women's rights and a thought leader in global health, and has been actually one of the leaders in global health, who is a woman who's very outspoken on the decolonization of global health, which is something that we really need, these conversations to not just end here with us. We need leaders to be taking this issue on, and I know that Anu has been doing that. And she's widely published in peer-reviewed journals as well, and popular media on topics on abortion, stigma, reproductive health, power and equity in global health. And I would like you guys to have a warm welcome to Anu, who's going to give us some few remarks.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Dr. T. This has been a really interesting session and pre-conference because it's been a long time in coming. We've been having these conversations for such a long period of time, and to have this many people together to really think about this makes me feel like there's a lot of momentum behind these ideas and the changes that we're seeking to make. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my own personal journey here. Since I became president and CEO of IPAS about 4 years ago, I really started to think very deeply about equity and power, but also white supremacy and the role that white supremacy plays in all of our lives, including my own. And that made me really reflect on how, now that I'm in a position of authority, what that does that mean for how I can work with and within this institution that I'm leading, IPAS. And it made me reflect on how our very sector, the sexual and reproductive health and rights sector, is rooted in white supremacy. Dr. T mentioned this morning, but it bears repeating, I think, that many of us know that certainly early family planning programs were not rooted in human rights. Many of them were rooted in very coercive ideas of who is entitled to procreate and who is not entitled to procreate. And that didn't come out of thin air either. That came through hundreds of years of manipulation, reproductive manipulation on the part of enslavers, on the part of colonizers, and who was actually permitted their bodily autonomy. That basis, that racist past, is very much at the core of our institutions and the way that we do our work. So I think we have to really acknowledge that this is part and parcel of who we are as a community and part of what we need to really dismantle and move and shift as we think about power shifting. But we can't do that until we really recognize our history. And our history is at best a checkered one. Including the history of IPAS and many of the institutions that are represented here. So one of the things that we've talked about a lot here is power. I want to be really specific about what we mean by power. We've talked about it a bit here, but let me just break it down in three digestible nuggets. Money. We've talked a lot about money. We're worried about where it's going, we're worried about where it's coming from, we're worried about how it's used, we're worried about the compliance and the risk-based model of funding. We're really worried about who's deciding about money and how they're going to spend their money and how it's amassed and held and the accountability structures or the lack of accountability structures. We've just heard from our breakout sessions that a desire for trust-based philanthropy or trust-based giving in opposition to fear-based giving, and I think that's a really interesting model to pursue. But it's not just about donors, right? That's definitely a very important part of it, but it's also within our own institutions how resources are allocated. There's a lot of power dynamics that take place during that process itself of budget negotiations, budget allocations, resource processes that we have to really examine and think about. So money is a really big aspect of power. We've also really talked a lot about knowledge production here. And so that, I think, is really interesting because it includes all kinds of things. It does include language. I'm really glad that's come up multiple times here. The language of power is English. And we have to figure out a way of making sure that everyone is included in this process, which doesn't mean everybody has to learn English. But it does mean that we need to acknowledge the hundreds, if not thousands, of languages that exist in the world that are not actually part of our conversation because we simply don't know of their existence and how to include these voices in our discussion. We also need to think about discourse. So that came up, I think, just now in the concurrent session report back. The discourse of development. So today I've been really reflecting on how we are using in a sense, the business approach for development. We've talked about supply and demand. We've talked about the business model for development. I don't know how that squares with the human rights framework. I wonder if it does. It's sort of a question. I wonder if it does. Does a capitalist approach really work with a justice framework? And so, I think discourse and language is really important. We've talked a lot about being helpers and co-creators in this space, and I think that kind of inclusive language could go very far in shifting power. And finally, the third aspect of power is on operations, or the practice of global health. So this includes everything from program strategy, design, execution, evaluation, the whole array of what we think about as global health practice, which very often excludes different healing systems, as we heard about this morning. We have very much one particular healing system that the Western medical model is the one that we're promoting. And we really don't know how to incorporate these other healing systems into our work. We know that they exist. We know that people go there. We know that people seek multiple healers for many issues, but how do we actually incorporate this in our work? I think that's something that we still really need to think about and develop. In addition to what we do, we need to think about how we do it, right? This is the operational piece that we've been talking about. So in thinking about the operational piece, there's very often a view that's kind of dichotomous in its thinking. We have to think, and it's often summarized in this sort of global north versus global south. And I really want us to maybe disrupt that way of thinking. I don't think dichotomous thinking is particularly helpful. I think it forces us to make choices that are not actually advancing us and advancing our missions. So we need, to my mind, we need to think about using every resource that we have available, because in our sector, we cannot afford to waste any resources. We simply don't have enough. So instead of pitting global north versus global south, it needs to be an and. It's an and, not an or situation. We have to utilize and deploy every resource that we have, but we need to use them differently. And think about how we deploy these resources differently, and at the same time not do away with them. So I think we cannot ignore the significant expertise and resources that live in the global north. But we need to shift the emphasis away from that and to really move them towards the global south. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about what we've been doing at IPAS, because I do think it's important, and I want to emphasize that it's a journey that we're on. We are not done and we are not completed, but we've done some thinking about this. And so let me share with you what we've been thinking. We've really been thinking about how we move power. So those three things: money, knowledge production, and the practice of global health throughout the organization. How do we move that within the organization of IPAS? And one of the ways that we've talked, what we're moving towards, is becoming a network. So what is the benefit of being the IPAS Impact Network? It allows us, first of all, to place the US, which still exists. There is still staff in the United States, and they are still, working and helping to achieve our mission. But the emphasis is shifted from them being the center to being one among the nodes of the network. And what is their role? The role of U.S. staff, and this is still in motion, is to help support, co-create the program implementers. The program implementers are behind the design and execution of our programs. This is really critical for IPAS. This is not just because we're thinking about power shifting. This is actually part and parcel of our mission, the abortion ecosystem mission, which relies on local stakeholders. It's not successful unless local stakeholders are involved and take ownership. So this is not really just a rhetorical thing. This is actually a mission-driven, we've got to make this work if we're going to be successful in our work as a whole. So this has required a complete shift in our decision-making model. We've talked a lot about, and that's come up already today, distributed leadership. At IPAS, we're talking about shared leadership. I think there's similar terminology, shared or distributed leadership. And that has, really does affirm one of our core values of interdependence. Practically, what this has meant is that staff from across the global network are involved in making decisions about money, particularly decisions about how money is allocated within the organization, decisions about organizational design, decisions about governance. And this has really resulted in a very sometimes messy process of figuring out what's happening within the organization and how do we move into the future. But it really relies on all of us, whether we live in the United States, whether we live in Nigeria or Nepal. It requires all of us to really live into our collective experience and expertise, because fundamentally, the expertise of our staff and our partners are what is going to get us to achieving our mission. So how do we harness this? From my point of view as president and CEO, my overall goal was, how do I make sure that every resource that I have available to me is used in the best possible way? So it's really about making sure that everyone in the network is participating in as vibrant a manner as possible. So, as I said, we're making this journey now. We're still on it. We're still learning a great deal. And there are many lessons to be learned. But I wanted just to share two of them with you today. The first is that individual and personal change is just as important as structural change. I'm constantly surprised at how much I and others in the organization need to unlearn, and how trained I am in the ways of doing business that I've always been involved in. I have been very successful at it. For over 20 plus years, these are the ways that we have worked. And the process of unlearning is pretty challenging. And I think that's something that we need to really grapple with. And a lot of the things that we've been doing are behavioral changes. How do we relate to one another? How do we actually behave in meetings? How do we make our decisions? These behavioral changes need to be learned, and they need to be practiced over and over and over again, because we are so accustomed to operating in a particular modality. We also need to really understand, and this is sort of the second lesson, the limitations of what we can achieve as individuals and organizations. While I entirely agree with our third rapporteur on the concurrent session that we need to think imaginatively and boldly, I think we also need to acknowledge that there are many systems of oppression that are preventing us or thwarting us from making the kinds of changes that we know we need to make. So one of the things that I've really been focused on is how do we continue to make the small or big changes that we can make that are within our control. All of us have things that we can do that are within our control that we can shift and change, regardless of what may be happening in the broader environment. I think it's really important to continue to look very carefully and examine our own role, your own roles in this journey, in this change process. We have to continue to analyze where power lies. It shifts, it changes, it moves. We have to continue to do a power analysis of everything that we're involved in, really do kind of a lay of the land, a landscape analysis. And at the same time, don't beat ourselves up when we can't make radical shifts right away. I think this happens a lot to us. We get kind of overwhelmed by the amount of change that we think that needs to be done. And then that shuts us down because we just can't figure out what to do. So I know that the next sessions that we're going to be working on is sort of what are the things that we can do as individuals and organizations, we all represent organizations here, to really move forward and continue this journey of shifting power. And from my point of view, I don't actually talk about, I've actually moved away from talking about decolonizing health because I don't really think that's a possibility. I mean, the colonial regime has been around for hundreds of years, right? So the idea of decolonizing or removing it seems remote. Instead, I think we need to think about being anti-colonial, which is linked to being anti-racist. So that is the vision, I think, that we need to hold. How do we become anti-racist? How do we become anti-colonial? How do we take the very structures of knowledge production, of funding, of behavior, and radically reimagine them so that we can do our work in the way that we know that it has to be done, in a way that respects the people that we're serving, in a way that includes the people that we're serving, and move towards justice. Not just reproductive health or rights, but justice. Thank you.
Hi everyone. How are you doing? All right. So very soon we will be wrapping up the Power Shifting Pre-Conference. We deeply appreciate your time and patience so far. My name is Goodness Ogeyi Ode. I am from Nigeria, and I'm a co-chair of the Power Shifting Pre-Conference. I work with IYAFP, that's the International Alliance for Family Planning, on the Sustaining Evidence-Driven Advocacy Project in Cross River State, Nigeria. So really quick, we would like to go through with you what we describe as the way forward, and more like how do we take some really concrete actions on all we have discussed. So Dr. T said, as much as we love the talk and how these conversations are going, we really feel that it would be great to move this conversation forward, right? We really feel that as individuals, as organization, it would be great that we can be able to leverage on some action points that you are willing to take on as you think it through, and we have continuous engagement. So really quickly, we will be having some polls where you get to send in your response. Yes, so let's quickly log in. I hope everyone can see the code. Is there anyone who cannot see the code or the QR code? So we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just, if you have been able to log in, can you say power shifting? Ah, great, great. Let's wait for a few others. 20 seconds, I guess, Should I read out the code? Oh, thank you. hash 355-9038. Hash 355-9038. So if you have been able to log in, can you say power shifting? We don't have a lot of people in yet. Okay, I think this is more bold. So the first question is, having just had the takeaways from today's concurrent sessions, what 2 actions would you like to prioritize as next steps? What 2 actions would you as an individual or your organization or group, what 2 actions would you like to prioritize as next steps from this pre-conference? And please, if you are yet to sign in, the code is still there. Oh, I like how this is going. I can see a lot of shift. Okay. So we have shift power strongly. We have listen, which is really key. Shift power, start conversation, power shifts, speaking truth to funders, reach out, respect, take back power, share knowledge, sharing decision making, support, be radical, justice, trust model of funding, transparency, hard conversations like the one we had today, take back power, okay, standard on localization, be radical, transform funding, disrupt, okay, power analysis, individual responsibility, invest in young people, I hear that. Advocacy, unlearn, which is really tough, but we need to. Trust-based, disrupt, change language, sustainable funding, social accountability, trust model. Okay, so thank you so much for those amazing response. We really need to go to the next question. I hope you're ready. So, has your comfort level talking about power shifting change during the conference? I'm very sure you had like some level of feelings or expectation, but having had this conversation, how has your comfort level changed during today's pre-conference? So you could just tell us if it's much more comfortable, a little bit comfortable, no change, less comfortable. I'll just give it a minute. Oh, okay. So I'm glad that we have like quite around over 80% to say that you are more comfortable or a little more comfortable in like addition. And we hope that those who are less comfortable would be willing to engage further for us to have this conversation to get more comfortable. Thank you. So would you support developing a global, widely endorsed call to action or commitment statement for power shifting in family planning? Because we're looking at what we can do after now. But then, it's not all figured out. It has to be an inclusive process where it's something you are willing to come in. So would you support that? Oh, yeah. So we can see that majority are willing to get in on that. Thank you so much for that response. Next. So finally, what concrete actions to shift power are you taking home from the pre-conference? What is that concrete action you hope to take home as an individual, as an organization, as a group on power shifting from the pre-conference? I like this, keep talking, very important. Speak up, fund advocacy, writing about it, take up space, listening, discuss, creating brave spaces, open conversation, justice, support youth, power analysis, transform funding, introspection, spreading anti-capitalism, prioritize delegates, support and share its feats, take back power, network, be radical, networking, keep talking, justice, listen, speak up, open dialogue, writing. Amazing. Not a tick box issue, I agree, I totally agree. Writing about it, consult, unlearn, support local consultants, consult, power analysis, educate donors, that's important. And yeah, all these amazing actions we hope to take. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And we hope that these actions, as typed here, will transform into real actions in your organization and individual life. So as a pre-conference, we are hoping to take this conversation further and engage with you all. And these are some of the existing statements that we have. 1 minute. Next slide. So these are some existing statements that are progressive on power shifting, and you may want to take it down so you check it up later. So we have fostering research integrity through the promotion of fairness, equity, and diversity in research collaborations and contexts towards a Cape Town statement. So you could just search it out and you could read through and see how maybe your organization or as an individual, there will be some useful learning points to learn from. Then there's the Research Fairness Initiative by corporate. And we also have authentic and equitable partnerships, a framework for building movement. So I'm just going to allow that to stay for 30 seconds, so those who are taking notes can be done. All right. So we also have plans to take this conversation further during ICFP. So it would be great to join us on Wednesday, 7 to 8 p.m., for us to have like a post-power shifting conversation with youth. So it's a youth roundtable, and yeah, we are open to older people too. So 7 to 8 p.m. Yeah, you can join us. And then if you have other conversations, because we believe in networking, I saw a lot of networking, talking, listening. As members of this particular pre-conference you've attended, if you want to just have small meetings, there's somebody you want to keep the conversation going. Like I personally have plans to keep the conversation going with Dr. Anukumar and Dr. T and every other amazing persons in my breakout session. You could have those roundtable discussions, and if you feel like you want to share with us, you want to see how to expand, we are open to that. Also, next slide, please. As a pre-conference as well, we are hoping to continue this conversation because we've had rich recommendations and take out from this. So we have plans to continue this conversation at the African Health Agenda International Conference, which is taking place in Kigali, Rwanda from March 6 to 8, 2023. At the same time, we also hope to continue this at the Population Association of American meeting, taking place April 12th to 15th in the US. And if you would be attending any of these meetings, it would be great for you to just come around or see how we can collaborate to work on something. Also, at Women Deliver 2023, taking place July 17 to 20th, at Kigali, Rwanda, we hope to be able to continue this conversation. I see some people excited. Yeah, I hope that we can continue this conversation there. So thank you so much for being part of this pre-conference. I'm going to invite Dr. T to give us the closing charge. Thank you.
I'm sure we are ready to take on the world right now. After a little bit, I do. I feel a change. There's things I've learned. There's things that have been reinforced, which is often great. And I feel really, really excited, but also privileged to be able to have moderated this session. There will be a QR code that will be on the screen. That code, you may take a screen grab, write it down. We would like some feedback in how you're experiencing the conference in the coming days with this issue of power shifting in mind. So we would like some feedback around the sessions you attend, the plenaries, the FP News Network. Are there things that you see in the conference that are relevant, that perhaps are missing, could have been done better? And we would like that feedback a lot. It will help us in formulating the next ICFP and what that should look like. That's really just the first step of meaningful participation. So the code will come at some point as I just do my closing reflections. And I just want to start by saying that when I took over the mandate on the right to health, I knew that I am coming into that role as a person who embodies many of the characteristics that are reasons why people get discriminated. And so it was never going to be business as usual. I'm a medical doctor, but I come from the so-called global south. I'm a migrant worker in Johannesburg. My hometown is in Qwaqwa. I'd rather be home, but there's no opportunity for me there, so I have to be in Johannesburg. I am an abortion provider, a proud abortion provider. I am a rebellious Catholic. I am a sexual pleasure advocate. I am an advocate and a human rights defender of sex workers and work in decriminalization. So you can see all of the different layers of me, right? And so it was important to bring all of that to the role at the UN. And the reason why I'm telling you this is that I want to read to you a quote that I think encapsulates a lot of what we are trying to understand with each other, of each other, but also of the context in which we do this work. And it is a quote that says, and I put this in my report to say to the UN and why a human rights approach to the right to health, but specifically sexual and reproductive health rights, is important, that I would look into how gender reaches into disability, disability wraps around class, class strains against abuse, abuse snarls into sexual orientation, and sexual orientation falls on top of race, with everything finally piling into a single human body. And my absolute call to you is that we all have to resist the siloed approach and the little bits and pieces that global health has been split into. It is a fractured system that will not work. As NGOs, as civil society, we are put in what I often refer to as the beauty contest for funding. Which organization looks best? Which one writes the best English? Which one has the best M&E framing? Which one? And it's about the issue and the people and the context. And so what conversations are we having with funders who set the agenda, who set the targets, who set the indicators, which do not speak to any of the needs of the people that we are serving on the ground? So the siloed approach is something that, for me, as a call to action, in whatever method we embark on after this, is something that we really have to think about. When a patient walks in, you know, she is whoever she is, but I may have a very good and resourced HIV facility with technology. She gets her results in 30 minutes. We do counseling. She initiates treatment. But she still needs vaccination for her child. She may need a pap smear. She herself may need questions around being perimenopausal and needs doctors and nurses who understand that she also has a right to sexual pleasure. Where must that woman go? Because that trip to the clinic required her to save money, sometimes for 2 months, just to arrive. And when clinics are set up in a way that you can't just walk in for service, they close at 4 o'clock. So if your ticket number is now number 110, sorry, come back tomorrow. So where must that woman sleep over that night? So when we say we want to eradicate cervical cancer, do we think about what it literally takes for women? When we say and hold back on emergency contraception for victims of sexual assault and rape, do we understand what it takes for women who are rape survivors to make it to a health facility in the first place, to then be turned back multiple times? I have many patients who only can really understand and internalize what has happened to them because they are now pregnant from a rape. And because there's no comprehensive sexuality support, support post-sexual assault that links the issue of emergency contraception, for example, people know that it's just a waste of my time going to the clinic. And so we have to see the issues that linked. Family planning is a great entryway, but it's not the only thing that our patients need. There's a context in which the need for family planning exists. So just focusing on family planning and commodities is enough. We are political. Our lives are political. I didn't have a choice as an 8-year-old who had to learn how to throw stones into a military armored vehicle. That was not a choice. So of course I'm political. My life is political. And so the work will be political. And these are the conversations we need to have with funders, with people who establish all of these goals. That human rights cannot be a choice. It's not optional. It's not an extra. Human rights are the basis in which all of us will realize all of our rights, including the right to health, and for the particular population and communities we are here for around family planning. And why should we care? Why should we care about human rights? We should care about human rights because they provide us key principles of equality, non-discrimination, meaningful participation, which we've heard of today. And I like the idea of decentralizing decision-making. I love the idea of trust-based, feminist-based grant-making. The issues of transparency. We don't know how decisions are made. We don't know who in global health, we can guess, but the issue is there's no transparency. Without transparency, there cannot be accountability. And the kind of work many of us in this room are doing in advocacy, in holding elected leadership accountable, requires us to have information. So the clampdown, for example, on social media of all of us who are tweeting and putting on Instagram issues around abortion care and our accounts being suspended, that is a problem. As family planning practitioners, we should be concerned. The Supreme Court of the US did a judgment on the Roe versus Wade case in June. And although that case was about abortion access, and we knew there would be a regression in the law, but we still had to show up in particular ways, and in my instance, submit an amicus brief to the court. It's that they've already hinted that they will limit rights to contraception. So what does it look like then as women who are living in the so-called global north, who need to organize in a particular way. Are you willing to trust black women who've been doing this work all our lives? And learn from how you mobilize communities, how you respect communities. It's very, very important. And the savior complex, we have to just let that go. And I say this to my colleagues with all of the love in the world. African women can save themselves. You have a lot of problems in your countries. Save yourselves as well. And in closing, I just want to really echo the gratitude that everyone has explained today in all of you joining us. And I would really, really encourage you to please use that QR code and the feedback so that we know how to shift this conversation, that it's not a once-off conversation at ICFP, that we really move the needle. And I like what Anu said, sometimes things don't seem like they are moving as fast as we want. But if we keep taking one step forward, before you know it, we will have moved elsewhere, somewhere. And yes, I think I've said everything I wanted to say, but let me see, let me make sure, because I have one shot at this. Yes, indeed I have. And thank you very much. Have a good lunch and rest, because we have the opening ceremony later, so we'll see all of you. But thank you very much for joining us today. And yes, that's it.